So let me set the scene. I just arrived from my first year of college. The year was, well, it was a few years ago. I'd met my roommate, who fortunately was normal enough. It was my first time living outside of my home, and I was beyond ready for life on a college campus. I was excited. And then I walked into my first class on my first day of school. The class? Introductory Biology. Just a basic course for all incoming freshmen. And it was in this class that my professor dropped a bombshell on my 18-year-old self. And the bombshell was this: science and faith cannot coexist. Now, the professor went on to explain that science was about observing the world around us. It's about deriving facts from what we can experience through our five senses. And faith? Well, faith didn't fall under that category. So, by this standard, faith wasn't compatible with science. And because science was about what was real, guess what that made faith? Not real. And at the time, this statement rocked my world. I'd attended church since I was a baby. I made the decision to follow Jesus in elementary school. I went to every student church camp. I was always hanging out with people from my youth group. My faith was an important part of my life, and within the span of 60 seconds, I was confronted with a huge question. Can you believe in science and still have faith in God? Now, most of us haven't been in a science class in years, and it's not really a subject that comes up in everyday conversations. But the tension between science and faith extends well past any university walls. As the world and our culture grow more technologically focused, it seems that the tension between science and faith is growing. In fact, instead of science merely being dismissive of God, it now seems like science is actively trying to disprove God. And if that's true, God must disapprove of science, right? Because we've been told this is a zero-sum game. If one is right, the other must be wrong. So we can start to feel like we have to choose between our faith in God and scientific facts and theories. But here's what's interesting about this tension. It wasn't always like this. For a long time, as scientific theory and exploration was developing, science and faith weren't considered to be at odds. In fact, many of the greatest scientists in history didn't have to choose between faith and science. Many of them were actually Christians. In the 1500s, a man named Copernicus taught humanity about the stars and the universe based on his scientific discoveries. He's the person who first recognized that Earth revolves around the sun, instead of the assumption that the sun and planets revolved around Earth. And he was a Christian. A century later, in the 1600s, Galileo made even more discoveries. Chances are you've learned about him in history or science class. He's known as the father of science. What you may not have learned is that he was also a Christian. Then in the 1700s, Sir Isaac Newton formed some of the most important laws of physics that have shaped human understanding of how things work. Those laws are still in our science textbooks today. And Sir Isaac? Christian. In the 1800s, William Kelvin discovered a ton about the way heat and temperature work. You may know this from your chemistry class. He's the same Kelvin who's the reason we use a Kelvin scale to this day. Oh, and also, he's a Christian. And finally, in the 1900s, a guy you may not have heard, J.J. Thomson, discovered electrons and the first subatomic particles. And no surprise, he was also a Christian. Do you see a pattern here? See, for centuries, some of the greatest scientists in history didn't feel forced to choose between belief in God and belief in science. So why does it seem like we have to make that choice today? For some reason, the 21st century convinced all of us to believe that Christians are afraid of science. The science is just too rational to line up with faith in an invisible God. But what if it doesn't have to be this way? What if we can be interested in and okay with science and still hold on to our faith? But more than that, what if science and faith actually relate? What if science doesn't necessarily disprove God? And what if God is actually okay with science? Here's the thing. Much of the apparent disconnect between science and faith is related to how things work. As more scientific discoveries are made, we learn more about how the world works. And the more things are explained, the less likely it seems like we need an omnipotent God. Over time, as science focused on how things work, mystery about the universe decreased. And for some, that made it feel like God was less important. But here's the difference between science and faith. Faith isn't about trying to explain how. Faith is about understanding the who behind it all. See, faith is about knowing the who is behind everything in our universe. And this is actually the exact place where the Bible starts. The Bible is a book full of historical stories and personal experiences from people who believed in and trusted God. In the first book of the Bible, most likely written by a man named Moses, the way the world came to be is explained. Here's how he starts the story of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is the exact kind of stuff a science textbook would say is ridiculous. How does an ancient story really explain anything about how everything came to be? But the Bible takes a different look at the beginning, a look that focuses on who, not how. As a result, there's been a lot of debate about how God created everything, and this conversation has led some people to attempt to discredit God's existence. However, Genesis isn't focusing on the how. The beginning of the Bible is more about who created everything than how it was all created. The job of science is to explain how it was all done. And although science does a great job with these explanations, its experiments, discoveries, and theories can't answer one of humanity's greatest questions. Did all of this happen by chance? And we've all wrestled with and wondered if we're just here by accident. Well, that's where Genesis comes in. The first sentence of the Bible is there to remind us that there's a God who set all of creation into motion. So no matter how much we discover about how the universe works, it doesn't mean we have to ignore who is behind it all. So what if the purpose of science isn't to disprove God, but instead to teach us more about how He works? What if science actually teaches us how the who behind creation put everything together? What if God and science don't have to be worlds apart? What if the account of creation recorded in Genesis simply shows us that everything science explains isn't by chance, but by design? Think about this for a second. Did you know that Earth is in the perfect position to sustain our lives? It's rotating at the perfect speed and orbiting the sun at the perfect velocity to keep gravity in place and us stuck to the surface. It's also at the perfect distance and tilted at the perfect angle to keep us safe from the sun's rays. Now, if there were just slight adjustments made to the Earth's angle, speed, or distance from the sun, human life, all life for that matter, would cease to exist. Now, maybe this was a perfect accident, but I don't buy it. I just can't bring myself to believe that the Earth and sun just happened to be perfectly placed to support life. I feel the same way about most things in creation. And that's why I love Genesis. It confirms what I was already suspecting. Creation isn't random. There's a who behind our existence. And you can believe in Him while still exploring the how that science explains. This is why we should embrace both the how and the who. If we treat them as though they're enemies, we're missing out on the beauty of both. If we think we can't pay attention to the how of science, we miss the opportunity to learn more about the who behind it all. And if we ignore the who, we miss the purpose and significance of the how. Science and faith aren't enemies. They actually build each other up. Science can help strengthen your faith in God, while God can use science to help you understand His work. In other words, science and faith can exist in the same space. Now, I realize this might be a different approach than you were expecting to hear in church. Maybe you grew up thinking that faith in God means you have to ignore or discredit science. Or maybe you didn't grow up in church. And one of your hesitations in taking God seriously is your perception that church is outdated when it comes to science or how the world works. Well, the good news is that you don't have to choose one or the other. Science and faith can go hand in hand. So how does this work? Well, instead of treating them like they're worlds apart, you can allow them to share the same space. You can put science and faith in their proper place. And because you're clear on the who, you can enthusiastically explore the how. If you have any faith or trust that God exists or any belief that He might be out there, then it's worth exploring how everything works. It's worth exploring the amazing handiwork of an amazing Creator. So when scientists explain how ocean currents work, or find a new treatment for a disease, or learn and name new subatomic particles, or discover a cluster of stars that's light years away, we can all marvel at the how behind the awesome who. And as we learn more about the intricacies of how the universe works, remember who was behind it all and praise Him for His work. When you begin to do this, you just might be blown away by God's power and creativity. Even if you're unsure about God right now, you might begin to grow in confidence of the who when you take the time to discover the how. This should be your approach to both science and faith. When you explore science with the belief that God is behind creation, then your response to science can be, so that's how He did it. Your faith can actually grow as you explore science. Now, this perspective puts science and faith both in their proper place. Imagine if people didn't get hung up on the tension between faith and science, but understood how they can work together. What if we could ditch the supposed bad blood between the two? Maybe some of you are still skeptical. Maybe your faith outs you squarely in an anti-science mindset. Or maybe your scientific take on the world challenges the idea of faith. You may have a million questions, and you know what? That's okay. The church isn't afraid of your questions. God isn't afraid of your questions. And if you're still skeptical, come back next week. If you struggle to believe there's a who out there behind the how, we're going to talk about it. But for now, remember, God and science don't collide. They complement each other, which means science and faith can exist in the same space.